ocean, if the ocean is in decline, which I'm about to explain why it is, then we need to reverse that decline. And how do we observe the decline? There's basically 5 areas which are very easily observable. One would be our fishing practices and overfishing. The other would be pollution, and everybody knows about marine plastic pollution. But the other 3 are probably less well known, but they're more pernicious in terms of the ocean's health, which is because of our anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions that we're pumping into the atmosphere. The ocean, which absorbs a lot of the CO2 and most of the warmth, the ocean is getting more acidic and it's losing its oxygen and it's getting warmer. And those 3 things are all bad for life in the ocean.
Thanks, Peter. I think a lot of people are, they don't make the connection with climate change and how that's changing the ocean and also impacting the ocean. But you did talk about anthropogenic threats and like fishing and overfishing in a lot of areas. And we know, up to 1 billion people are directly dependent on the ocean for food and food security. And a lot of these people are in developing countries. And so this is also a huge sustainable development challenge. We know that, a 1.5 to 2 degree world is devastating for coral reefs. We're going to lose 17 to 90% of our coral reefs. Why should people be concerned about what's happening to coral reefs around the world?
Well, I come from an island which is ringed by a mighty coral reef, and I just cannot conceive of a world without coral reefs. And in terms of the protection, in terms of the nutrition, in terms of the biodiversity, they're bunkers of biodiversity for the ocean. So remember what I said about no healthy planet without a healthy ocean. How can you have a healthy ocean without coral reefs? We don't know the answer to that yet, but we're going to find out. So why should we care about coral? We should care about coral because we care about our children and our grandchildren. And, their security is linked to the fate of coral. So we have to be very aware of it. And I'm sure we will discuss during this program, what those causes are of coral's demise, which is what we're observing at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to lose somewhere between 70 and 90% of coral by about the year 2050 if we continue on our current path.
Thanks, Peter. For those of you who've just tuned in, welcome to our Facebook Live with UN Special Envoy for Oceans, Ambassador Peter Thomson. My name is Carol Phua. I run the Coral Reef Rescue Initiative on behalf of a group of partners, WWF, Wildlife Conservation Society, Rare Blue Ventures, University of Queensland, CARE, and Vulcan. Today, we're just talking a little bit about why it's really important for us to focus on ocean conservation and why that needs to be a global priority, especially around SDG 14, the Sustainable Development Goal 14, which focuses on life below water. Ambassador Thomson just talked a little bit about why coral reefs are important. When we're standing to lose 70 to 90% of our reefs if we don't act on climate change as well. WWF and its partners are focused on the 10 to 30% that will survive in 7 countries in Tanzania, Madagascar, Philippines, Indonesia, Solomon Islands, Cuba, and Ambassador Thomson's home country, Fiji, as well, which houses the Great Sea Reef, which is a very important reef system, not just for food security of Fijians, but also has a great spiritual value for everyday Fijians as well. So Peter, is there still hope? Would you say, is there still hope for us to reverse the trend, to bend the curve, to the benefit of people who are dependent on reefs and other ocean ecosystems?
The moment we give up on hope, we might as well just give up on life. Of course, there's hope. And that's why the member states of the United Nations have given as the theme for the next UN Ocean Conference, which is happening next year in Lisbon, the theme of solutions and partnerships and science. These are all very positive things. And when you apply it to those problems I was talking about before of pollution and acidification and overfishing, you apply that and you should be full of hope, but you should not be full of lethargy because that is the destroyer of hope. We've got to get out there and take action. So let me ask you, Carol, on coral, I know WWF and yourself have done a lot of work on this. What sort of solutions are you seeing based on science for coral reefs.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think our solution is very much science-based. If we know climate change is going to be impacting different parts of the ocean differently, we're really looking at reefs that are less exposed to climate change. How can we secure these reefs? And especially in developing countries where we know people are incredibly dependent on these reefs remaining healthy to provide them shelter and food security as well. And so focusing on these countries will help us repopulate reefs when the climate does stabilize. And so this approach is a part of the Coral Reef Rescue Initiative with our partners, very much science-based. I think we need to prioritize where we work as a global community, and that prioritization needs to be driven by the need of developing countries and communities that are incredibly dependent on these resources. And that requires us working in partnership with governments, with private sector, with communities as true partners on equal levels as well. And so we're really providing options, other options for coastal communities. I think poverty is really hard and very confronting, especially if you don't have any other option. If your only option is to continue fishing, then the resilience of these communities is, of course, very very vulnerable, and requires us to help them and provide other options, and that requires us having public private sector partnerships coming into these countries as well. So that's a huge part of our initiative. We're of course dependent on governments prioritizing the type of actions that you're talking about, right? So political will is still key at the end of the day. If politicians and leaders are being a bit malaise about it and not really following up with the SDG targets in a tangible way with policies and budgets and investments, then it's really hard for us in the NGO and private sector also to come in and support coastal communities. In the Pacific, we know that these large island states have a huge role to play, and Fiji has this huge role to play. How can we be more supportive of politicians from the Pacific as well as a global community, Peter?
Well, that gives me a chance to say something about the Great Sea Reef in Fiji, because I'm a WWF ambassador for the Great Sea Reef in Fiji. We used to call it the Bainiborliku. I used to live up on that coast. And it's one of the world's biggest coral reefs. I dove on it a couple of years ago. It's very vibrant still. It happens to also have a fantastic mangrove coast on the other side of the lagoon. So it's a great fisheries resource for the communities that live along that coast. Look, I think the important thing is that there are, in terms of also riffing off that hope message that I was giving, there are a lot of good people and good organizations now working around the world on coral reef restoration and protection. And, I mentioned, for example, ICRI, which is an intergovernmental organization running out of UNEP. And if your government is not a member of that, I think you should lobby them to join it. I know Fiji and Australia are leading lights in ICRI. There's also the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, a multi-million-dollar fund that's just been set up and is administered by UNDP. And so if you've got projects, big projects, they can be funded. So, all in all, for me, where the money needs to be spent, and perhaps this is not what you see when you look at coral programs, but where I think where the money needs to be spent is on land, on the coast that is fronting these coral reefs. A lot of these coasts are pumping chemicals and excess fertilizers and plastic pollution and so on down their rivers and streams. We need to tidy up our act on land. We need to adopt the ridge to reef or source to sea ethos. And not only will that help our coral reefs, but it'll also help our seagrasses, which are absolutely essential to combating climate change because of their carbon sequestration properties.
Thanks, Peter. I think a lot of people don't realize the ocean is downstream from everything. Everything. The ocean absorbs all the pollution, all the runoff issues. I mean, we see that also in the Great Barrier Reef and other places. If climate change is already putting that kind of pressure on reefs, then reducing the other anthropogenic threats is going to be critical. By anthropogenic threats, I mean like you mentioned, water quality, addressing the waste issue, flowing into these reefs as well. So that's going to be very critical for us in terms of ensuring that these reefs remain potentially resilient and healthy so that they can provide the services. Before we go on to talk a little bit more about the Oceans Conference that's coming up in Lisbon next year, Peter, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to just talk a little bit about how does SDG 14 work with the other SDGs? I don't think all the SDGs were meant to be dealt with individually. It's really the suite of the SDGs. So how does the SDG 14 sit in relation to the other SDGs?
Well, I think you raised a very important point there, and I won't go into each one of the SDGs. There's 17 of them and many targets. But to all listeners, if you're not familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, you should be. Why do I say that? We have one blueprint for saving humanity's place on this planet, and the blueprint was agreed to in 2015. On the one side, it's the Paris Climate Agreement, and on the other side, it's the what is called the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, which has the 17 Sustainable Development Goals embedded in it. They are the action part of the agenda. So in those 17 goals, you've got things like, ending hunger and addressing education, making sure everybody gets a good education, everybody has good sanitation. It's another one, and good water supply, that there's affordable energy for everybody. There are 17 of them. As I say, I won't go into them all, but the ocean is linked to all of them. I mentioned no hunger, for example. There's one of the goals, right? You've got to have a thriving blue foods system going on in the world, whether it's sustainable aquaculture, whether it's propagating more seaweed for human consumption, other non-fed aquaculture like shellfish, for example. It's better management of our wild catch, because at the moment we're overfishing. We have harmful fisheries practices still out there. Those have got to end. So you link all those, which is what SDG 14 is trying to do, better conservation and better sustainable use of the ocean's resources. Link that with the hunger one, and the connection is obvious. And the connection with health, the health SDG is also obvious, because blue foods are such nutritious foods, and so on. You can go on through the 17 goals. But if you haven't seen them, please do read them, because they're part of the blueprint for your survival and your children's survival on this planet.
Yeah. Which is now a good time for us to talk a little bit about Lisbon, Peter. You mentioned it earlier already about the theme for Lisbon coming up. I mean, Portugal has always been a very important ocean country as well. What can people look forward to in Lisbon next year?
Right. Well, like all of you, I've been in my bunker for a long time. I'm based here in London at the moment, and I've been in this bunker, but I'm coming out of my bunker in a few days' time. I've got to fly to New York to address the UN General Assembly. We're having a high-level meeting there on the ocean, where all the 193 member states will be briefed by the leaders of all the various UN agencies on the state of their responsibilities on the ocean, whether it's fisheries or whether it's pollution, or whether it's the development of the sustainable blue economy. So it'll be a very interesting day in New York. And then the week after that, I have to be in Lisbon for a ministerial conference there. But for me, of course, most importantly, sitting down and talking about arrangements for the UN Ocean Conference next year, which is being held in Lisbon. So that's why I say I'm out of my bunker. That's good news for me, because obviously I was very frustrated when the UN Ocean Conference had to be postponed, because it was to have been held pretty much a year ago, and we had to postpone it because of the COVID pandemic. So at the moment, we're with conditions all allow, and touch wood, we're on the right track now with the pandemic. We'll be holding the conference, towards the middle of next year.
Thanks.
What's going to be achieved at it? The first UN Ocean Conference was really the explosion of awareness of the ocean's problems. I think the second UN Ocean Conference, member states in their wisdom have called, as I said before, for solutions, science-based solutions, partnerships. So I think that's what they're going to see, just a ramping up of ocean action based on science-based solutions.
Thanks, Peter. If you've just joined us, welcome to WWS Facebook Live with the UN team. My name is Carol Phua. I'm the Global Coral Reef Rescue Initiative leader. And today I have with me Ambassador Peter Thomson, who is the UN Special Envoy for the ocean. And we're talking about why ocean conservation and action around ocean should be a global priority. And I think a lot of us have spent a lot of time on the coast. If you're fortunate enough to go on holiday along the coast before the pandemic has hit, you would know that it's an important place for coastal communities and for tourism and other livelihood sources as well. And you've touched a little bit about COVID as well and the pandemic and how that's impacting us as well. I mean, there will be a new normal for all of us beyond this year. We know that there was a paper that I was a part of that talked about how COVID has impacted marine protected and conserved areas. We know a lot of the coastal communities have lost their livelihoods, Peter, and this is going to be a huge challenge in terms of rebuilding those sustainable livelihoods in a coastal area. But resilience building is a very important part of working with communities, and I'm sure with the SDGs as well, that much more systems approach, thinking about how can we support communities in building resilience and providing alternatives and options beyond what the traditional options are for fishing, for example, or agriculture. So how much of that really depends on innovation and technology, Peter, do you think? What is the role of innovation and technology in helping us support sustainable development goals?
Yeah, well, Carol, to be honest, I guess the very name innovation means that I don't know yet because somebody's going to innovate it. I've got a few innovative ideas I want to put in front of people. But look, I think the main thing is, in terms of what you've just said there, that because of the impact of the pandemic, I think people have realized, wow, we cannot continue with this one-way linear exploitation of finite planetary resources. We chop down all the forests. Where the disease is going to go, they're going to go into us, right? And we've proved that with this pandemic. And if we carry on with our current course, we're going towards a world of over 3 degrees by the end of this century. That's within the life of my granddaughters. And, that's obviously a future we must refuse, because over 3 degrees, and it's a world on fire, and WMO actually says, I think, between 3 and 5 degrees. So, and coral is gone at 1.5 degrees. So this is just unacceptable. So absolute transformation, not just of our thinking, but of our actions and our consumption patterns, our production patterns. This is what we have to go through. And will we go through it? Of course we will, because we bend in the direction of survival, not in, some suicidal path, which is, as I say, a linear path of finite planetary resources is a suicidal path. We have to be thinking circular. We have to be thinking sustainability. We have to be thinking balance with nature rather than exploitation of nature. We've got to live within nature. It's not a business relationship. We live within nature. And we have to start thinking like that again, rather than thinking we're some kind of superhuman, entity that can go on without it.
Yeah.
So, I think the times are changing. I think young people are realizing they don't want that for their future, and governments will respond to the people eventually.
Peter, I just wanted to really just talk a little bit about hope before we go into the kind of action people can take. Hope is really important in today's day. There's a lot of negative news, and we know that if we continue behaving the way we do with what we eat and how we live our lives, not thinking really about how this impacts people on the other side of the planet, people who are really dependent on the ocean, that's going to have a huge negative impact for all of humanity and the planet's health as well. So what do you think is really important for us in terms of keeping that hope alive? How do we keep the hope alive in terms of making, inspiring people to do something, to act, to conserve and to protect the oceans?
Sure. Well, I think individuals play a very important part in this, as well as families and communities,
Mm,
corporations, cities, and of course governments and multinational organizations. We all have our part to play. I get a lot of hope out of my work promoting what I call the sustainable blue economy,
mm,
because I truly believe, having been working on it for a number of years now, that it will be the bedrock of human security in the future. If we look at components of the sustainable blue economy, right? Not the blue economy, that's just
mhm,
more exploitation. Sustainable blue economy. We're looking at things like renewable offshore energy. There's enough energy out there to power the world, 20 times over. If you take tidal currents, if you take wind offshore energy, if you take currents, etc. And anybody who's put their toe in the water at the ocean can feel that kinetic energy, right? So energy, easy. That's sustainable blue economy. We just have to turn the climate finance needle in the direction of that, and that's our power needs met. Then we get into food, and for good quality nutrition, the ocean offers so much, and that non-fed aquaculture that I was talking about, eating more seaweed, algae-based foods, feeding aquaculture fish with algae. The sustainable aquaculture has huge ability to feed places where it currently is present in very small numbers. For example, the African continent.
mhm,
Just a vast opportunity there for the development of sustainable aquaculture. Then, you look into things like greening of shipping. We're on the cusp of a revolution in powering the global shipping fleet. At the moment, the global shipping fleet burns the dirtiest kind of fuel, which is bunker, which is the low
mhm.
end of the oil industry. And we've got to get away from that. We've got alternatives, which in development, we're on the cusp of changing. So greening of shipping is another good one. I could go on, but the ocean just has so much to offer if we think of the sustainable blue economy.
Great. Thank you, Peter. So, we always say when we want to, engage with the public and empower individuals there, you want to inspire them. And I think the global community has been hugely inspired by a lot of the nature documentaries that have been out there. And there is a great awareness. And now, we're hoping that they feel activated to do something. And we want to mobilize people to actually make a difference in how the ocean is going to be healthier and recover. So there's three things that we're asking people to do, Peter. I'm quite excited to just simplify what needs to be done. You and I have been talking about this as well. So we're asking people to do the 3 A's. First is to adopt a low carbon footprint lifestyle and diet. If you don't need it, don't eat it, is what I say. It's very simple. If you can ride your bike, and that's always, and take public transport. So adopting a low carbon footprint lifestyle benefits the planet and the ocean. Secondly, Peter, we were talking about amplifying the voice of the ocean. And here you also talked about the UN conferences being a very important role, and really speaking on behalf of communities that really depend on the ocean. And there's a couple of links there from the WWF team that's going to be shared about the UN conference and Ghost Gear, stopping Ghost Gear as well. And finally, Peter, maybe you can speak to this about advocate for a healthier ocean. And there's two big events coming up, the Climate Conference of Parties and the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of Parties. Why should people really put pressure on their politicians to be ambitious and follow through on some of these targets like Paris?
Sure. Carol, I really love your 3 A's, and I want to give you credit for that. It wasn't my idea. The adopt, amplify, and advocate. Because look, all of us can adopt better practices. I've done it in my own life. I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but my wife and I, when we were living in New York, when I was at the UN, we looked at the 10th report that we had seen on the damage that beef was doing to the global planet, and what the predictions were in terms of water supply and destruction of forests and everything. And it was just too much. We finally thought, we got to make some decision on this. And we looked at a photo of our grandchildren and said, what do we want? Do we love our grandchildren or do we love our hamburgers? And we said, obviously, we love our granddaughters more. Okay, we gave up beef on that day, right? And we haven't touched beef since. And that's 7 years. And, I'm not preaching on that. I'm just saying to everybody, look at your diets, look at how you can change. Change is a constant. We do not eat today what our grandparents ate. So we can eat something different and our children can eat something different, more sustainable, healthier, if we just look at it, and make the changes and have the gumption to do that. Because lifestyle, it comes down to the individual in the end, because you don't want it forced on you by a government. That's a different kind of government. Then the amplification and advocacy. Really important that, you don't just sit back and expect other people to do all this for you. The individual is so important. I learned so much from my children when they were teenagers on things like recycling. That's where I got it from, the family dinner table. So you have big influence in your communities, in your schools, at your business places, and exercise that influence is what I would say. When we get up to the international level where I've been working, again, advocacy is really important. There are so many serious issues going on in the world. It's easy for the ocean to just slip off the table, but we're going to make sure that never happens again. And when you've got really important conferences coming up, like the CBD conference in China in October, and then the climate conference happening in Glasgow in November. These are world-changing conferences. And we're going to make sure that the ocean, the sustainable blue economy, and the solutions that the ocean can provide are front and center at those conferences.
Thank you, Peter. So we really encourage you to really think about how do you then adopt a lower carbon footprint lifestyle, thinking about how do you amplify the voice of the oceans and those who are or dependent on the oceans, and also think about how do we then advocate for a more ambitious target around the protection of the ocean and climate challenge as well. So we really want to thank you for joining us on this Facebook Live. My name is Carol Phua. I run the Coral Reef Rescue Initiative. Check out our website, coralreefrescueinitiative.org. I also want to thank Ambassador Peter Thomson for joining us today for Facebook Live, and check out the UN.org website and the SDG 14 website as well. And final words, Peter, before we log off.
Thanks, Carol. No, it's been a pleasure talking to you from one side of the world to the other today, and I hope our listeners got something out of it. Final word I'd leave with them is that old adage, act as if what you do makes a difference, because it does.
It absolutely does. And thank you very much, Facebook, for joining us. So I would say, as they do in Fiji, Vinaka Vakalevu, terima kasih, and have a lovely evening. Thanks, everyone.